China matters. We know that because the current president of the United States is having a huge trade war with China. We know it because it is soon going to be probably the world's biggest economy. We know it because it is the world's biggest exporter and the world's second largest importer. And China also matters because it is likely that in many of the shops that you buy goods in, you're probably buying goods originally that were manufactured in China. And China matters because last year, 140 million Chinese traveled as tourists throughout the world. And when you think from 1949 to 1976, there are only 740,000 movements in and out of China, and then in 1 year, 140 million. So that is the difference between the Maoist period from 1949 and today. But despite being a country of huge statistics, the sort of shock and awe statistics that we all read about in our media, China is also a human story. It's a story of the rise of a nation after a really tough modern history and the aspirations of Chinese people. And that is, after all, a fifth of humanity. So today, I thought I would talk about three very specific things that will have an impact on everyone here and will have an impact on our futures, our global futures, and talk about the new land and the new world that's creating. And they're three very specific things, the first of which is the nature of Chinese strength and power. So in modern history, we have been very, very used to a China which is weak. And our mindsets, when I say our, I mean people in Europe, people in North America, basically non-Chinese, we are quite comfortable with the idea of a China which is always marginal and on the edges. And this China was bypassed when it was the Qing dynasty in the late 17th century by modernity, despite the fact that there was an early phase in Chinese history when it was a great inventor. About 1,000 years ago, it invented the three great propellers of modernity: magnetic compass, the printing press, and gunpowder. Despite it being an innovator at that time, it didn't industrialize. And while in Europe and Great Britain, the Great Industrial Revolution happened, in China, this simply wasn't the case. So China's first real engagement with modernity in the Opium War in 1839 was a great catastrophe. And it started 100 years, which is still talked about and weighs heavy on the collective memory of Chinese to this day, of humiliation. And that kind of period of weakness, a kind of huge impact on China's prowess and its international image, is really still a live issue. And yet today, under the current leader, Xi Jinping, we see a China which is powerful. It sounds powerful, it looks powerful. As the statistics I've just gone through show, it really is powerful. And that is a huge change, not only for it and its own image of itself, but also for us. We have to change our mindsets. It's not just about China. It's about our response to this new kind of power. The second is the manifestation of that power, of the three that I'm going to talk about. And the manifestation of that power is, for the first time in modern history, China is a naval power. That's never happened before. From the 1980s, it has built up, in numerical terms at least, the world's largest navy. Although, of course, technologically, it's far, far behind the United States. And that China is a completely new China because until recently, until the 1980s, it was only really a land power. In the very early period, from the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in 1400, there was a very brief period of about 15 years when the eunuch admiral, Zheng He, built this incredible navy which reached to the east coast of Africa and into Indonesia. But that period ended very, very quickly. And now we are in an era, again, in which China is a naval power and one that we see manifest its material strength and power on the high seas, deep into the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in these areas in which it is incredibly important. The question really is, though, how do we interpret that power? What do we think about that naval power? Is it really likely that in the future, in our kind of future lives, we will be seeing sea battles like we did in the past? Is it really likely that we're going to see the kind of naval wars that we saw in the last century? Or is conflict going to be manifested in the invisible world, in the virtual world? and in that sense has it already started. In many ways, China's power now is kind of haunting us. It is invisible. It has this extraordinary invisibility. And that virtual war is one that China is always, in many ways, already winning. And therefore, is it really that the naval powers and assets that China has are a great distraction? They're a distraction against this kind of real power that China has, which, as the French philosopher François Jullien said, haunts, but it doesn't act. And it's really our expectations as outsiders observing this that are preyed upon. We think that China will act in a certain way, but is it really going to do that? And is it already acting in other ways that are invisible and behind and within the world in which we live? But the third issue that I want to talk about today is the most profound and the most difficult. And that is that we don't really know what a world run according to Chinese values looks like. And in fact, no one knows. It's never happened before. When I say Chinese values, what am I talking about? It's not just the kind of values that China is run according to today. Marxism, Leninism, and since a couple of years ago, this new body of ideas called Xi Jinping thought. What we really see is a China which is built its ideology and its kind of civilization on profoundly different roots and a different intellectual tradition to that of the West. If you think of 2,400, 2,500 years ago, the period of the great philosophers in Greece, and the tradition that kind of flowed from that, what we have, I suppose, is a commitment to this idea of a singular truth, the uniform truth. And the idea, as F.W. Moat, the great imperial historian, said, of a kind of truth with a capital T. But really, China is the great dissenter to this idea of the universal. You could argue that, in a sense, the universal, with a capital U, was created from European traditions. And that continues to this day in all of the different discourses that we operate in as specialists and technical experts. And yet China is the great dissenter. Its intellectual traditions are hybrid. The three great teachings that we talk about when we look at Chinese histories, and I mean that in the plural, there have been many different Chinese histories over the last 2,500 years. And this idea of, at the heart of them, a plural mindset, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. And these existing happily in a kind of flexible worldview in which there is no desire to have one particular winner. And in modern times being contributed to by ideas like Marxism, Leninism, and then the more modern ideas that we get today of Maoism. And then finally, the result of all of this, capitalism with Chinese characteristics. When you go to China and you look at the landscape, you think of this as being a place of enormous hybridity and energy, and a living monument to this hybridity at the heart of the Chinese worldview. But the issue really is that that worldview contests and dissents from the dominant American and European view of the desire for universality and for truth with a capital T. And hybridity, therefore, is something that I think has a kind of uneasy impact upon us. It unsettles us. It's manifested in all sorts of different areas, from our discourse about human rights, to our discourse about the rule of law, to China's engagement in the international system. It seems that China, since 1978, when reform and opening up started, and after the Maoist period, China really started to reach into the world and engage with the wider world, it has done it with maybe a double mind. On the one hand, on the basis of utility since 1978, it has really engaged with international systems and with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and others, really kind of won. But on the other hand, it doesn't believe in the underlying values. And it's clear because Xi Jinping, the current leader, has said, since he came to power in 2012, that China does not subscribe to this set of underlying values. And that, I suppose, is the problem, because if China has these values as a fifth of humanity, as the world's second largest economy, as such a major player, what do we do about that? Is it really likely that we are going to enter into this era of sort of great transformation, where the world magically becomes like China and has a Chinese worldview, or that China magically changes and becomes like us? Well, we've tried the latter for the last 30 years through engagement, and I don't think that has really worked. It is not likely that China politically, and certainly not socially or culturally, is going to become like the outside world. It is an exceptional power. It regards itself as very exclusive, and it regards its attitude to the rest of the world also as exclusive and excluding. And therefore, when we have on the one hand the United States, and on the other China, we kind of have this possibility of a future which could be perpetually in conflict, one in which you have two such different powers who don't really have a common language between them, apart from utilitarian capitalism. What kind of world would that lead into in the future? A world in which China lives comfortably in its kind of Sinocentric sphere, what some people have called a pax sinica, and a world in which America is perpetually frustrated by this great dissenter, the contestation of a China that does not accept the American view, the European view, and the wider view of the world. What do these two kind of powers do when they talk to each other? And when they kind of try and finally engage, is it going to be that they have real conflict, or are they going to live in a kind of zone, each of them, where they just accept and tolerate each other? The only real case in history, in deep history, in which we can think of two such significant powers happily coexisting with very different value sets was 2,000 years ago, at the peak of the Roman Empire under Augustus, and in the Han Dynasty in China. These two amazing powers with huge influence and economies, and yet they existed because they had no contact with each other. There is no archaeological evidence of any real magnitude that shows that the Han Empire and the Roman Empire ever really had dialogue, apart from through intermediaries. And therefore, is that likely to be a model for the future? Are we really likely to see an America in its space, a China in its space, and just happily living alongside each other, like they're living in two separate kinds of blocks of flats or two communities? The difference, of course, between 2,000 years ago and today is that there is plenty of contact. America and China talk to each other almost continuously, and they really have shared space all around them. We're really going to see, therefore, a viable bipolar world, a world in which you have this kind of constant tension that we all happily live with between two such different worldviews. This is going to be a world, I guess, where we are perpetually living in tension, where we are living between two houses, and those who are ambiguous kind of have to occupy this space in between. So this is not an easy vision of the world's future. There is, I suppose, another alternative, and that is we look at the Chinese value system and its hybridity and its diversity and its richness of over 2,500 years, and as we learn more as outsiders about this and engage with this, we also feel that this is something, this diversity and hybridity, that can enrich us, enrich our intellectual spaces, that it's not a contest, it's not a competition. We can accept that when China says that it contests the American, European idea of a kind of uniformity, a universality, that is also itself liberating. It gets us another perspective, another vista. But these are going to be really, really tough choices, and it's likely that the communities that deal with them are not knowledgeable, not particularly aware, maybe not up to speed in the kind of view that China has of the world to engage with it properly. And so we are at this great crossroads. When we look at these two extraordinary traditions, the European Enlightenment one broadly and the Chinese one, we have a kind of choice. We have the pathway in which we really commit to one view over the other, or we try and maintain a kind of ambiguity or a balancing between two very different worldviews, and we don't commit. There is one thing, though, that is absolutely certain. In 1968, 4 years before the United States had rapprochement with China, Richard Nixon, who was then the presidential candidate, wrote a very famous essay in Foreign Affairs in which he said it was impossible, and if you remember at that time, America had no real contact with China. It was still the Cold War. When Richard Nixon said in that article, basically, we cannot contest, we can't oppose the aspirations and the ideas and the hopes of a fifth of humanity. And that really was behind his political commitment to having dialogue and having rapprochement and having détente with China. And of course, we live in that world today, the world that was created after he went to China in 1972. But in the modern era, I suppose, as we see China's incredible success as a capitalist country, we return to that idea, that proposition of Richard Nixon. How can we possibly think that a fifth of humanity, with their incredible energy, their dynamism, their aspirations, and their hopes, are just going to pack them up and live in a little space that's been carved out for them and sort of accept this subsidiary position? So when we think of these three issues, China's strength, China's naval assets as a manifestation of its strength, Chinese values and what they mean and how they could enrich and enliven our worlds or be an issue for them, we also have to think of this as being a period of great change and transformation for us. The great Chinese sinologist, Simon Lees, originally from Belgium but then based in Australia for many years, said that the most exciting and amazing thing about engaging with another culture in any depth is the way that it not only changes in front of you, but changes you. And that's what I think is so exciting about this era, that China's rise, for all of the challenges and for all of the potential threats and issues, is also perhaps the first time in modern history that we have been given this opportunity to change ourselves and think in a different way. And that, I think, is tremendously exciting, and I hope that many of you will be able to embark on that incredible journey, because it is one that is really going to shape our global future. Thank you.